You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In July of 1846, 28-year-old doctor Ignaz Semmelweis reported to the Vienna General Hospital in Austria for his first day of work. Vienna General had been established over 60 years earlier in the 1700s. Dr. Semmelweis was proud to work there, and even more proud to be working in obstetrics, where he'd get to help expecting mothers. As part of his job, Dr. Semmelweis would work in one of the hospital's 2 maternity wards. Dr. Semmelweis felt optimistic, but also nervous. He'd only recently graduated from medical school and was relatively young for such an important position. But his strong work ethic had helped him rise through the ranks quickly, and he was determined to prove himself to his new coworkers. That day, Dr. Semmelweis walked up the cobblestone street to the hospital's double doors. He pulled them open and went inside, walking through the echoey hallways until he reached the first maternity ward, which was called the First Division. He wanted to make a good first impression on his new coworkers, so he smoothed out his mustache and straightened his jacket. Then he opened up the door, and what he saw next completely changed how he felt about his new job. A pregnant woman was kneeling on the floor, crying and screaming, but she wasn't giving birth. She was begging a doctor to let her leave and go to the other maternity ward, which was called the Second Division. The woman on the ground said she would do anything to be transferred there. If she stayed where she was sure she would die. Dr. Semmelweis had heard rumors about the First Division maternity ward. In fact, most people in Vienna had heard these rumors. There were whispers that the First Division was far more dangerous than the Second, that women who gave birth there were far more likely to become sick and die. Looking on from the doorway, Dr. Semmelweis wanted to rush forward and comfort the crying patient. But the other doctors had already lifted her off the floor and put her onto one of the many beds in the room, assuring her everything would be just fine, but she was going to stay here. Even though Dr. Semmelweis was technically in charge, he didn't want to interrupt what was happening. He still felt like he didn't really understand the dynamic of this place, and he needed to learn his way around the wards and win his colleagues' trust first. A few hours later, the same woman who'd been crying on the floor asking to leave the First Division went into labor, and Dr. Semmelweis supervised the delivery. And after seeing how scared this woman was, Dr. Semmelweis let the woman squeeze his hands during the delivery so tightly that his fingers turned blue. Thankfully, though, her delivery went smoothly and she gave birth to a healthy baby. But even though she and her child were okay, Dr. Semmelweis couldn't get the image of her crying and begging to leave the First Division out of his mind. The situation still made him very uneasy. He wanted to make sure women did not feel afraid under his care. And so Dr. Semmelweis made up his mind to learn as much as he possibly could about this First Division and see what was going on here. As afternoon turned to evening, Dr. Semmelweis pulled another doctor aside to talk about what he'd seen that morning. They stood in the hallway outside the First Division, their jackets stained with blood and sweat from a long day's work. Dr. Semmelweis told his colleague that they were both men of science. As such, he asked if there was any scientific proof that the First Division was in fact deadlier for the women inside of it than the Second Division. The other doctor said yes, there was scientific evidence that demonstrated that. He dropped his voice low, just in case any patients were in the halls, and he told Dr. Semmelweis the mortality rate for mothers in the First Division could be as high as 18%, but in the Second Division, it was much lower, only about 2%. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Those numbers meant that nearly 1 in 5 women died in the first ward, but only about 1 in 50 died in the second. Suddenly, that woman's fear from earlier in the day seemed totally justified. The other doctor explained to Dr. Semmelweis that the patients in the first ward seemed to be dying of something called childbed fever. This was a poorly understood illness that affected women who'd recently given birth. 1 to 3 days after delivering their baby, these women would develop severe abdominal pain and high fevers and would sometimes become delirious, and then they would die. Dr. Semmelweis' colleague stopped speaking for a second as another doctor rolled a woman by on a gurney. When she was back in the maternity ward, safely out of earshot, the doctor continued. He said there had been plenty of meetings at the hospital to discuss the differences between the 2 wards, but even one of the hospital's leading disease experts, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Jacob Kolechka, couldn't find anything to explain the vast difference in mortality rates. Dr. Semmelweis scratched his chin and glanced down at his blood-stained jacket. It really needed to be washed, and he really needed to get home and get some rest. He thanked his colleague for the information, and as he walked down the hospital's hallways, he thought over everything he'd just learned. Dr. Semmelweis believed it was his responsibility to figure out exactly why so many women were dying at this hospital in this first ward. He decided that the very next day, he would visit the second division and try to learn what made it so much safer than the first. The following morning, Dr. Semmelweis grabbed a new, crisp white coat from his office and put it on. He walked down the echoey hallways toward the maternity wards, then opened the door to the second division. It looked nearly identical to the first division. Dr. Semmelweis took note of the same pale walls, the same beds lined up in rows, the same ventilation systems bringing fresh air into the room. However, the patients in the second division seemed much happier and more at ease. Dr. Semmelweis walked past their beds to the back of the room where all of the equipment used during deliveries was stored, and he began pulling open a few drawers. Inside of them, he saw stacks of metal forceps and scalpels. They were the exact same tools used in the first division. Dr. Semmelweis turned away from the storage area and back to the main section of the room, where he watched staff members bustle from one patient to the next. And that's when he noticed something interesting. There was one major difference that Dr. Semmelweis could see between the staff of the two maternity wards, and he thought it might be the key to solving this mystery. Several months later, the doctors and medical students who worked in the first division gathered in one of the hospital classrooms where medical lectures were normally held. It was a small space with wooden tables lined up in front of a chalkboard. Dr. Semmelweis stood at the front of the room, deep in thought, one hand nervously twirling the end of his mustache. Over the past few months, he'd gone back and forth between each ward, taking note of how the different staff members worked. Eventually, he believed that he'd gathered enough evidence to prove his theory, and so he'd called this meeting with everyone who worked in the first division to let them know what he'd discovered. Once everyone was in their seats, Dr. Semmelweis announced that he'd been keeping a careful eye on the first and second divisions, looking for something that could explain the huge difference in mortality rates. He said the two wards were similar in almost every way except for one. The first division, so the more deadly division, was staffed entirely by male doctors and medical students. The second division, the safer one, was staffed by female midwives. In the mid-1800s, when this story took place, midwives would have gone through an apprenticeship program, not a formal medical education. Because of this, they were considered less educated than doctors and wouldn't have been allowed to teach medical students. But since Vienna General was both a hospital and a medical school, it needed two maternity wards, one for doctors who could train students to handle pregnancy and childbirth, and another one for midwives who mostly managed the place themselves. For Dr. Semmelweis, the fact that the two wards had such different personnel seemed very important. Then, Dr. Semmelweis said something that shocked this room full of doctors and medical students. He wondered aloud if maybe the midwives actually knew how to deliver babies better than the doctors. The doctors scoffed, and the medical students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the idea that midwives might be more knowledgeable than they were. Dr. Semmelweis was uncomfortable too. It wasn't easy for him to consider that after years of medical training, he might not be as much of an expert as he thought. But Dr. Semmelweis didn't want to let his ego get in his way, so he pressed on. He told the men he'd noticed that women gave birth on their backs in the first division. That was a standard procedure for doctors, supposedly because it gave them a better view and more control over the birthing process. But in the second division, the safer one, where the midwives worked, women typically gave birth on their sides. This tended to be more comfortable for the patients and reduced the risk of injury. Dr. Semmelweis theorized that this difference might be the reason why so many women were dying in the first division. He told the doctors and medical students that moving forward, every woman giving birth in the first division should lie on her side instead of her back. Dr. Semmelweis watched the men murmur and roll their eyes, but he didn't react. He just thanked them for listening as the meeting ended. Then they filed out, leaving Dr. Semmelweis alone in the classroom. He exhaled, glad that the meeting was over. He still felt relatively new at Vienna General, and taking on this responsibility made him nervous. But he'd stepped up and done what he could to fix the problem in the 2 maternity wards. He left the classroom hopeful that this new change he had just implemented would actually work. Over the next few months, Dr. Semmelweis spent more time in the 1st Division, making sure everyone was following this new protocol by having the patients give birth on their sides. Now, there was not an immediate change in the mortality rates, but Dr. Semmelweis held on to hope that his idea would work eventually. Only it didn't. Almost every day, Dr. Semmelweis heard about or witnessed multiple women dying in the 1st Division. He had to admit that his theory must have been wrong. Even with this new policy, the mortality rate in the 1st Division was as high as ever. In February of 1847, less than a year after Dr. Semmelweis started his job at Vienna General, an average of 2 women died every single day in the 1st Division. Desperate to figure out what was really going on, Dr. Semmelweis spent his mornings in the hospital morgue doing autopsies on women who had died of this childbed fever. He, along with many other doctors and medical students, searched the women's remains for some clue as to what was really killing them. One morning, Dr. Semmelweis stood in the cold morgue, taking shallow breaths and trying to ignore the smell of death. He'd asked the hospital's disease expert, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, to sit in on the autopsy. Dr. Kolechka was tall, broad-shouldered, and clean-shaven, with dark hair that he kept combed to one side. Dr. Semmelweis saw him as a mentor and was glad to have him looking on. Dr. Semmelweis pushed his scalpel into a woman's chest and began dragging it down her body. He peeled back layers of skin, fat, and muscle, and he found the same thing he did in other women who had died of childbed fever, an inflamed abdomen full of swollen sores and pus. Dr. Semmelweis and Dr. Kolechka both agreed that these were clear signs of some kind of infection. And yet, neither of them could determine what exactly the infection was or how it was spreading in the 1st Division. Dr. Semmelweis set his scalpel down and rested on a metal stool. He looked around. He was surrounded by dozens of dead bodies of women he was supposed to care for. He had blood on his hands, literally from the autopsy, and also figuratively, because he clearly had not been able to prevent all these women from dying, and so he felt like he had totally failed them. Dr. Semmelweis stood and wiped his hands on his jacket. He then told Dr. Kolechka that he needed a break from this place, the morgue, the maternity wards, the entire hospital. Maybe a vacation would help him clear his mind, and he could come back and look at the problem with fresh eyes. Dr. Semmelweis took off his bloodied jacket, hung it on a hook on the wall, and then went to tell his supervisors that he was taking a trip to Venice. A few weeks later, in March of 1847, Dr. Semmelweis returned from his vacation. The time away had done him good. He'd been able to rest, to enjoy the museums and food that Italy had to offer. Now that he was back in Austria, Dr. Semmelweis felt reinvigorated. He showed up at the Vienna General Hospital for his first day back at work, and as soon as he walked inside, one of his colleagues rushed up to him in the hallway. The doctor looked pale and sad. He told Dr. Semmelweis that there had been a terrible accident while he was gone. His mentor, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, had died. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Dr. Kolechka had been young. He asked his colleague what happened. The other doctor sounded unsure as he explained it. Dr. Kolechka had been doing an autopsy on one of the women who died in the 1st Division. It was all routine. Some medical students were even in the room helping with the examination. Then one of the students accidentally cut Dr. Kolechka's finger with their scalpel, and the wound became infected, and a few days later, Dr. Kolechka was dead. Dr. Semmelweis swallowed the knot that was growing in his throat, and he shook his head in disbelief. The story was as heartbreaking as it was frightening. Dr. Semmelweis did autopsies all the time. He never imagined that getting a tiny cut during one of those autopsies could kill him. But while Dr. Semmelweis was obviously reeling from this terrible news, his mentor's death also made him curious. He asked his colleague if an autopsy had been done on Dr. Kolechka's remains. His colleague said yes, and said that he would go down to the lead pathologist's office and grab the records if Dr. Semmelweis wanted him to. Dr. Semmelweis just shook his head and said he would head there himself right now. Just a few minutes later, Dr. Semmelweis sat in his dimly lit office, poring over his mentor's autopsy report. What he found in those pages astonished him. The physician who had performed Dr. Kolechka's autopsy wrote a detailed account of what he had found inside the dead man's body. Dr. Kolechka's abdomen was inflamed and filled with swollen sores and pus. It sounded exactly like what happened to the women in the first division who died of childbed fever. This was odd because the medical consensus at the time was that only women who had recently given birth could contract childbed fever. But Dr. Kolechka's autopsy report seemed to prove that idea wrong. Dr. Semmelweis thought it all over. His mentor had been doing an autopsy on a woman who died of, apparently, childbed fever, and Dr. Kolechka got a cut on his finger, which then became infected and led to his death. To Dr. Semmelweis, only one possibility made sense. Dr. Kolechka must have caught childbed fever from the corpse, that somehow it got into that cut. Suddenly, everything clicked for Dr. Semmelweis. The answer to the mystery of the First Division was right there in front of him. It all led back to the morgue. Dr. Semmelweis knew that each morning, doctors and medical students completed autopsies in the morgue. He did it too. And like doctors everywhere in those days, they did their grisly work barehanded. That's why it was so easy for Dr. Kolechka to get cut. Then, after being elbow deep in dead bodies that were often filled with infectious diseases, they would head up to the maternity ward to deliver babies, often without washing their hands first. Looking over his mentor's autopsy report, Dr. Semmelweis theorized that Dr. Kolechka contracted childbed fever from what he called cadaverous particles inside the corpse he was examining. They were probably all over the unwashed hands of doctors and medical students who did autopsies each morning. Then they spread those particles to women in the First Division, directly causing the spread of childbed fever. And Dr. Semmelweis had a clear explanation for why the same thing did not happen in the Second Division that was run by midwives. Midwives do not do autopsies. So there was no way they would ever come in contact with any of these so-called cadaverous particles that could spread this illness. Dr. Semmelweis pushed the autopsy report aside. He jumped up from his desk and sprinted down the hallway to the First Division. His findings could save countless lives. As soon as he got to the first maternity ward, Dr. Semmelweis made an announcement. After completing their autopsies, all doctors and medical students would be required to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before they entered the First Division. Chlorine was one of the only known chemicals that could completely remove the smell of dead bodies from clothing, medical tools, and people's skin. Because it got rid of the scent, Dr. Semmelweis figured it would also remove the cadaverous particles that were spreading this deadly illness. And the results of this new hand-washing policy were remarkable. In April of 1847, the First Division had a fatality rate of 18.7%. By June, the fatality rate had dropped to only 2.2%, about the same as the Second Division. Dr. Semmelweis had just inadvertently discovered how to use hand washing to stop the spread of infectious disease. These days, we know the cadaverous particles he talked about were actually just germs. But this was years before the scientific community began to accept the idea that disease can be caused and spread by microorganisms like bacteria and viruses. At the time, the idea of hand washing with anything more than just water was totally radical, and Dr. Semmelweis actually faced a serious backlash for his suggested policy. Many doctors at the Vienna hospital undermined him and refused to follow his protocols, because according to them, doctors were gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands were always clean. Dr. Semmelweis fought back and actually ended up losing his job. And unfortunately, after he was fired, the hospital returned to its totally unhygienic way of not requiring doctors and medical students and everybody who's on staff to wash their hands. It would take another 20 years for germ theory to catch on elsewhere, and for hand washing with antibacterial chemicals to become common in medical facilities. By that time, Dr. Semmelweis was dead. He passed away in 1865 after contracting a bacterial blood infection called sepsis, which, ironically, he got after a cut on his hand became infected. In 2010, Kayla was a senior at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a big party school. And one Friday evening, Kayla and her friends were at a big party, and Kayla was having a great time, but she was starting to feel really tired. And so she asked her friends if maybe they wanted to leave early, but none of them did. And so Kayla left on her own. Luckily, her house was just down the road, and so she was at her front door in a matter of minutes. That night, her two roommates, who were also college seniors, had decided to stay in and just have a nice night with a couple of friends having some wine. And so when Kayla walked inside, she happened to turn to the right, and she looked on the closest wall where there was a sofa, and she saw there was a guy laying there with a blanket up to his chin, and his eyes were wide open. She didn't recognize him, but he was staring at her, and she figured, oh, he must be a friend of her roommates. But as she walked across the room, she kind of glanced back at him, and he had pulled the covers down slightly, and he had lifted his head up, and he was staring at her kind of menacingly. And so Kayla got a really bad vibe from this guy and just kind of hustled into her room, shut the door behind her, and locked it, something she never did. And a few minutes later, she was in her bed and she was passed out. A couple of hours later, she woke up to what sounded like tapping on wood. And so she sat up in her bed and she's kind of looking around. She had a couple drinks the night before and she's half asleep, so she's a bit disoriented. But finally, when she gets her bearings, she realizes this tapping sound is the sound of someone drumming their fingers on the outside of her door. And so she's looking at her door, wondering who would be doing that. And then all of a sudden, the drumming stops and it's replaced by the sound of this person scratching on the outside of the door. And so now Kayla's thinking, okay, is this guy who was out on that couch, is he playing a joke on me? And so she's sitting there wondering if she should just go over there and open the door and tell him to stop. But before she gets out of her bed, the scratching gets louder and louder and louder until it's so loud that it's kind of menacing. And so Kayla decides she's not going to go out there. And so instead, she pulls out her phone and she texts her roommate and says, hey, can you please come out in the living room and take care of your friend who's harassing me? But she doesn't get a response from that roommate, and the scratching is just still loud as ever. And so she texts her other roommate the same message, come out and take care of your buddy here. But again, she doesn't get a response. And now the scratching on the door has stopped and it's been replaced by jiggling of her doorknob. And so now Kayla is just mad because this is obviously a prank and it's a dumb prank. And so she yells out, hey, stop! But it doesn't do anything. And so now Kayla's like, okay, I gotta call my roommates, wake them up, they'll come out and they'll handle it. And so she calls one of her roommates and they do pick up this time. And Kayla angrily tells them, hey, come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's totally harassing me. And her roommate was confused. She's trying to make sense of what Kayla's saying. And she says, Kayla, what are you talking about? What friend are you talking about? And Kayla says, the guy sleeping on the couch, the guy in our living room sleeping on the couch. And her roommate said, Kayla, we didn't have anybody over last night. Is somebody out there? You need to call the police. Kayla's adrenaline surged, and she very calmly told her roommate, lock your door immediately. And right then she noticed the jiggling of her doorknob and the scratching, and it all stopped. And Kayla's wondering, where did this guy go? And then after a couple of seconds, she heard extremely loud banging coming from across the house where her two roommates shared a room. And it was the sound of this guy trying to smash down their door. And so Kayla's screaming, her roommates are screaming. Kayla manages to dial up 911, and before long there are sirens outside, and Kayla hears the sound of this guy run across the house, and she hears the sliding door open and shut. The police come inside, they search the property, and there's no sign of this guy, and so Kayla and the roommates come outside. They talk to the police, and the police bring them over to their side door, and they show them on the outside there was all sorts of scratch marks all over the doorknob and right around the latch. And they said it looks like he was able to jimmy his way into your house through this door. And so then they asked the girls to give their statement about what happened, and they started with Kayla. They went over to her bedroom door so she could demonstrate what happened, and that's when they noticed there were all these scratch marks and gouge marks all over the outside of her bedroom door, and all over the doorknob, and all over the latch. And on the ground was a pair of scissors and a knife. And the police told Kayla that it looks like he used those scissors and that knife to open up the side door, and he was trying to use those tools again to open up her door, but for whatever reason, he just couldn't do it. They told Kayla that most likely when she went in the front door, she caught this guy off guard. Maybe he was trying to rob the place, maybe he had just broken in, but either way, Kayla got in and ruined his plans. And so he leapt onto that sofa, the one against that inner wall, to kind of tuck himself away in hopes that maybe Kayla wouldn't look over and see him. And they told her that most likely when she made eye contact with him, she became a witness and therefore a target of opportunity. And had she not locked her door, who knows what would have happened. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot. And this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway. And it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road, but at night her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's gonna be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we gotta get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's gonna be now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no streetlights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left, but there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, Mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat, and she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going, don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up, she's rocking back and forth, she's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. So she rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell and she's looking at her mom and she's like, what's happening? What just happened? What did you see? And her mom's got her hand over her mouth and she's speeding down the road and she's crying now. And she's looking at Misty and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, what did you see? What happened? And finally her mother just said, she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me. And so Misty screams and she's crying and her mom is crying and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911 and she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, Who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington State. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees. Any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and you know, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago, because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, you know, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon, and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away. And so Matt just goes back to his campsite and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And then the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?